Thank you, Peggy. My name is Charlie Barnman. I'm still a very grateful recovering alcoholic. I'm glad to see everybody back here this tonight. It's getting kind of late. Be a little later before we get through. But I think we'll all perhaps enjoy it and learn something about our book and a little bit more about step 4. Before we start into it tonight, I've been asked repeatedly today to tell you about my dog that I have at home. I've got an old dog at home that I feel a lot about, and I just love him to pieces. Now, everybody who has a dog usually calls him Rover or Boy, but I call mine Sex. Now, Sex from time to time has been very embarrassing to me. When I went to City Hall to renew his license, I told the clerk I'd like to have a license for sex. He said, well, I'd like to have one too. And then I said, but you don't understand, this is a dog. And he said, I don't care what she looks like. Then I said, but you don't understand, I've had sex since I was 9 years old. And he said, boy, you must have been quite a kid. When my wife Barbara and I got married and went on our honeymoon, I took my dog with me. And I told the motel clerk that I would like to have a room for my wife and me and a special room for sex. And he said that every room in the place is for sex. And I said, but you don't understand, sex keeps me awake at night. And the clerk said, me too. One day I entered sex in a contest, and just before the competition began, the dog ran away. Another contestant asked me why I was standing there looking around. I told him I'd had planned to have sex in the contest. He said, well, you should have sold your own damn tickets then. And I said, but you don't understand. I said, I'd planned to have sex on TV, and he called me a real show-off. When my wife and I decided to get a divorce and we separated, we went to court to fight for custody of the dog. And I said, Your Honor, I had sex before I was married. The judge said, me too. And then I told him that after I was married, sex left me, and the judge said, me too. Last night, sex ran off again, and I spent hours looking around town for him, and a policeman came over to me and asked, what are you doing in this alley at 4 in the morning? And I said, I'm looking for sex. My case comes up in court next week.
My name is Joe, and I'm a real alcoholic.
That's what he says every time.
Through God's grace, and because this program works in my life, I haven't found it necessary to take a drink a day, and for this I'm extremely grateful. We're starting back into our inventory process. We set the stage for step 4, and we'll begin this morning. And what we think is, we begin to realize more and more the power of the 4th step. And we'll begin this inventory. And as we begin, we compared it to a business that takes no inventory will go broke. And we looked at ourselves as a business of living. And we began to fill out these sheets. And the first number 1 problem was resentment. Resentment is the number 1 offender. And we began with the brief, very brief, simple directions at the bottom of page 64. They're very, very brief. It enables us to use the example on page 65. And we begin with the first by making a list of people, institutions, or principles with whom we were angry. Then the second column, once we completed that column from top to bottom, we asked ourselves why we were angry. Fill in the second column. And as we notice this, we notice that the simple procedure, we would have to get the first column down, completed. And it's from the first column that we can develop the information in the second column. The second column comes from the first column. And Once we put down, then we look at, in most cases, we found it was our self-esteem, our pocketbook, our ambitions, our personal relationship, including sex, which were threatened. Then we look at the second column and develop the third column, which part of self was affected. Now, after we get these three columns down, one at a time, then we can begin to look and read across and see for the first time the true picture of each resentment. And there's another word that's very, very important we're going to come up on later on at the end of this chapter. You know, we've always talked about listing our resentments. That would be really the first or second column. We could list our resentments. But by using this whole inventory process of the big book, it says we can list and analyze each resentment. And that's the key thing, not just the listing of them, but to be able to analyze them with the inventory in the big book. We can not only list them, but for the first time we can analyze them and get the true picture of each resentment. And this is the process of elimination these things from our mind. Step 4 shows us really is real positive in getting rid of these things if we do it as the big book lays it out. And now that we have got these things down and looked at them, now we're going to go on to work with the rest of step 4 and see the two that he doesn't leave us there with them. Once we analyze them, he shows us how to get rid of them in step 4.
I think another thing that we've been able to see as we look at this inventory sheet and do it the way the big book said to do it, that this really is something that's relatively simple and easy to do. I think a great mistake we make in AA today is we keep procrastinating and waiting around until we're sure we can do step 4 right. In other words, we're implying what we're trying to do is wait till we get well before we do step 4. And that really isn't the purpose of the steps. You know, we do the steps first and then we get well after we do the steps. And then this book will recognize that we can only do so much in step 4. We'll never be able to get it perfect. In another place we'll look at in a little bit, it talks about our grosser handicaps. And the gross handicaps are these 3 basic manifestations of self that the book is going to talk about, with resentment being the number 1. That's the main thing that blocks us off from God's will. And almost anybody, and you really don't have to be sober for a very long period of time, can fill out this sheet. You know, when we listed column 1, and we did exactly like Bill did on page 65, and we went from top to bottom listing them by number as we went. Everybody knows who they're mad at. And it really isn't difficult to make a list of those people, places, and things, because we know what we're mad at, and we really don't have to be sober very long to do that. And again, as we looked at Bill's example on page 65, he listed Mr. Brown, Mrs. Jones, my employer, and my wife. And we said surely he had more resentments than that. He just didn't want to take up any more room in the big book. And I found that when I once started listing resentments, it just kind of rolled right out of me. And I was absolutely amazed at the number of resentments that I had. I was absolutely amazed at how resentments had dominated my thinking and controlled my life for many, many years. In the same way, when I do column 2, the second instruction in the book said we list the cause of our anger. Why are we mad at these people? And at the side of each name, going from top to bottom, we listed the cause of the anger. In Bill's case, he was mad at Mr. Brown because of his attention to his wife. And he told the wife of the mistress. And Brown might get my job at the office. All of us not only know who we're mad at, but we know why we're mad at them. And it's a very simple matter to fill out column 2 from top to bottom, writing down the cause of the anger. And then I find that for the first time in my life, I realized it's not the people I'm mad at, it's what they did. And as we said earlier today, if Mr. Green did the same thing that Mr. Brown did, I'd be just as mad at Mr. Green. If Mrs. Pumpernickel did the same thing Mrs. Jones did, I'd be just as mad at her. It's not really the people I'm so mad at, it's what they did that has got me so incensed and so full of anger and resentment. And I didn't know that until I filled out column 2. And then when I filled out column 3 to see which part of self was affected, which was the third instruction in the book, for the first time in my life I began to see where that anger really comes from. I began to realize it's not from those people. It's really not from what they did, but it was my reaction to what they did. And my reaction was always based upon a threat to or an injury to one of my three basic instincts of life. It would be absolutely impossible for me to get mad at you unless you threaten me in some way. Now, if you threaten my social instinct, if you threaten my security instinct, if you threaten my sex instinct in any way whatsoever, then I'm going to get upset with you. But until you do that, I will not get upset with you. And the amazing thing that happened to me is, for the first time I realized where this anger really does come from. And all my life I'd tried to control anger because I knew it created problems for me. I knew it kind of fouled up my thinking. I knew it caused me to do things that later on I would be sorry that I did them. But I never could control it because I didn't know where they came from. For the first time in my life I see that they come not from you, not from what you do, but my reaction to that based upon the three basic instincts of life. So already I've learned three things about me just by filling out the sheet. But that isn't all we have to do with resentments. My book is going to carry me further with resentment starting at the bottom of page 65. It says, we went back through our lives. Nothing counted but thoroughness and honesty. When we were finished, we considered it carefully. Now, the resentments that I have in my head today, and remember we talked about that being our stock in trade, how we think today. The resentments I have in my head today did not necessarily come from what happened to me today. Most of my resentments stem from what happened yesterday, last week, last year, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 and 20 years ago. And the statement that says we went back through our lives, we carefully review our resentments and we will see that these things have been with us for years and years and years and years. So we're really looking back through our lifetime as far as resentments are concerned, but those are the resentments that are in our head today. Now the first thing apparent was that this world and its people were often quite wrong. To conclude that others were wrong was as far as most of us ever got. Well, I already knew that. I already knew that the world and the people in it were often quite wrong. And to conclude that they were wrong as far as I'd ever gone with a resentment. I could always see exactly what you did wrong. And to conclude that you were wrong was as far as I ever went with that resentment. Now the usual outcome of that was that people continued to wrong us and we stayed sore. Sometimes it was remorse and then we were sore ourselves. Sometimes we could see where we had done the wrong thing. And we'd feel guilty about that and we'd get mad at ourselves for doing those things. But the more we fought and tried to have our own way, the worse matters got. As in war, the victor only seemed to win. Our moments of triumph were short-lived. Always was trying to get even with those people for what they did to me. Always fighting with them. And as in war, the victor only seemed to win. Once in a while I would get even, very seldom, but once in a while. But then that didn't last very long. And the book said it's plain that a life which includes deep resentment leads only to futility and unhappiness. When my mind is filled with resentments, that pretty well paralyzes me. Very difficult for me to get anything done that's worthwhile when my mind is absolutely filled with resentments and churning with that anger and etc. To the precise extent that we permit these, do we squander the hours that might have been worthwhile. And I stopped right there and I thought back in my life and I tried to see what resentments had done to me in the past. I tried to see where I had wasted lots of time dealing with resentments. And I found to my amazement that I have literally put in thousands and thousands and thousands of hours dealing with resentments. Back when I was drinking especially, one of the first things I loved to do when I got up in the morning was to have a cup of coffee and a drink of whiskey and then turn on my resentment machine. And then I'd play that sucker up here in my head in slow motion and living color, and I would play what you did to me yesterday, and what you did to me last week, and what they did to me last year, and what they did to me 10 years ago, and what they did to me 20 years ago, and 25, and all the way back to the time that I was a little kid.
Now, I really don't know why I did that so much, but it seemed to me that was one of the favorite things that I loved to do. And I guess maybe one of the reasons I always loved it so much is it seemed to make me appear a big shot in my own eyes. After all, if everybody else is picking on me, then I must really be something important. And I'd play that thing and play that thing and play that thing, and I could play it for at least an hour every morning. And when I got through playing the resentments, I'd have another drink of whiskey and another cup of coffee, and then I'd turn on my get even machine. And then I'd start figuring out what I was going to do about each one of those resentments. Now, the next time they do this, I'm going to say that, and they're going to say this, and Sanko, I'm going to put it on them. By God, I'm going to show them. They can't do me that way. And I spent literally thousands and thousands and thousands of hours in those resentments, and to the best of my knowledge today, I can't see where it ever made me 1 cent, period. I can't see where it ever did me any good whatsoever. It never did help me in any way that I can see. It never did help another human being in any way that I could see. It never made any money for me that I can see. And the only thing I can say about them today is those hours were literally squandered, absolutely wasted hours. And those were hours that I could have been using for something useful. If nothing else, I could have been painting the house. I could have been mowing the grass. I could have been playing with my children. I could have been having a decent conversation with my wife. I could have been visiting with friends. But all the time I spent in resentments had me absolutely paralyzed, and those hours were squandered and wasted. Now, that's bad, because I only got so many of those things left to live. And I most certainly don't want to waste any more of them in something that is absolutely useless as far as I'm concerned. But that really isn't the worst thing about resentments. Here's the worst thing about resentments. But with the alcoholic whose hope is the maintenance and growth of a spiritual experience, this business of resentment is infinitely grave. We found that it is fatal. For when harboring such feelings, we shut ourselves off from the sunlight of the Spirit. They effectively block us off from God's will. Now, shut off with the sunlight of the Spirit, then the insanity of alcohol returns, and we drink again. You know, if we don't find a way to where we can be sober and peaceful and happy and serene and feel good, eventually the mind goes to searching for a way to feel better, and it always thinks back on alcohol. And we begin to think that maybe it wasn't that bad, or maybe this time we could have a couple and it'd be okay. Or after all, you've been sober now for 6 months and you've proven you're not an alcoholic, and all of a sudden the mind seems to kind of snap and say it's all right to drink. The insanity returns and we believe a lie. We believe we can drink, and sure enough, based on that belief, we end up taking a drink. And with us, to drink is to die. If we were to live, we had to be free of anger. The grouch and the brainstorm were not for us. They may be the dubious luxury of normal men, but for alcoholics these things are poison. We turn back to the list, for it held the key to the future. We were prepared to look for it from an entirely different angle. Now, always before I looked at it to see what you had done wrong, and looked at it to see what I was going to do to get even with you. But today I'm looking at it from an entirely different angle. Today I'm looking at it from the angle that if I continue with these resentments, they're going to cause me to drink. And if they cause me to drink, they're going to kill me. It's no longer, in my mind, a question of whether a resentment is justified or not. It's no longer a question of who's right and who's wrong. The only question in my mind today is, what does a resentment do to me? And if it blocks me off from the sunlight of the Spirit, then eventually it's going to kill me. And I'm looking at it from an entirely different angle. We begin to see that the world and its people really dominated us. In that state, the wrongdoing of others, fancied or real, had power to actually kill. And again I stopped, and I thought of what had been going on in my life about resentments. And I realized suddenly that here I am the guy who always thought that I run my own show, that I'm the guy that always stood on my own 2 feet, and I'm the one that always made my own decisions, and I'm the one that always said nobody's going to tell me what to do. I suddenly realized that other people have been telling me what to do all my life through my resentments toward them. You know, if I'm filled with resentment towards you, then you have control of my thinking. And if you have control of my thinking, then you also have control of my actions. And if you're controlling my thinking and my actions, then you're the one that's telling me what to do. And I thought always that I was the one telling me what to do. And about the time I realized that, I thought, oh my God, some of these people have been dead in the graveyard, buried for the last 25 or 30 years, and they've been reaching out from the grave, and they've had me by the yang-yang all my life. And I made up my mind right then that I'm going to do away with that stuff. I'm not going to let these people live in my head rent-free anymore. You know, I want God to direct my thinking. I decided that in step 3. And God can't direct my thinking if other people are directing my thinking. And for the first time, I could really see what a resentment does to me. It gives other people control over my life. In that state, the wrongdoing of others, fancied or real, had power to actually kill. Now, how could we escape? We saw that these resentments must be mastered, but how? We could not wish them away any more than alcohol. You know, resentments come from self-will. Self-will is a God-given thing, and only God has the power to take care of self-will. And it seemed as though the only way I'm going to be able to get rid of resentments is through the use of God's power also. Self-will cannot overcome self-will, and every step in the book will recognize that from now on, that we're going to have God's power to overcome these things. This was our course. We realized that the people who wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick. Though we did not like their symptoms and the way these disturbed us, they, like ourselves, were sick too. We asked God to help us show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience that we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. When a person offended, we said to ourselves, this is a sick man. How can I be helpful to him? God save me from being angry. Thy will be done. Now we hear over and over and over about the 3rd step prayer and the 7th step prayer, but we never hear anybody talking about the 4th step prayer. And here's a prayer on page 67 that we can use to help us get rid of resentments. And it seems as though the only way that we can get rid of some of these deep-rooted resentments is to pray for those that we resent. And this is very, very difficult for we alcoholics to do. It seems as though it's almost impossible to do, but it really isn't. You know, Bill said way back in the beginning, simple, but not easy. A price had to be paid. It meant the destruction of self-centeredness. And if I want to get rid of these resentments, if I see what they're doing to me, and I see where they're blocking me off from God's will, and I see where they're going to cause me to drink eventually, it seems as though sometimes the only way that I can get rid of a resentment is to ask God to take this resentment away, to pray for those that I resent. And we'll see an example of that on page 551. If you have the 3rd edition, if you happen to have a 2nd edition, it would be on page 560. Let's look and see how prayer can be used to get rid of a resentment.
This is a second of the story, Freedom from Bondage. I've had many spiritual experiences I've been in the program, many that I didn't recognize right away. For it's slow to learn, and they take many guises. But one was so astonishing that I would like to pass it on whenever I can, and I hope that it would be helpful to someone else as it has me. As I said earlier, self-pity and resentment were my constant companions, and my inventory began to look like a 33-year diary, for I seemed to have resentments against everyone I had ever known. All but one responded to the treatment suggested in the steps immediately, but this one posed a problem. You know, when we look at and do the inventory on resentments of what they're talking about here, respond to the treatment. If we analyze our resentments and lay them out and read them across, we'll get rid of about 90% of these resentments most of the time. But we alcoholics look at ourselves as pretty intelligent people. When we look at our resentments and analyze them, about 90% of them look double-dumb, you know, and we don't like to think of ourselves as dumb people. When we have the realization through analyzing what we're doing, 90% of them will disappear in the 4th step. And this is what the 4th step is so positive about. It gets rid of these things. And then the ones that they can't get rid of by analyzing, they will be some would stay. Then we're going to see how these can be dealt with. Now this one that stayed, it was against my mother. It was 25 years old. I had fed it, fanned it, and nurtured it as one might a delicate child. It had become much as part of me as my breathing, It had provided me with excuses for my lack of education, my marital failures, my personal failures and inadequacy, and of course my alcoholism. And though I really thought I was willing to part with it now, I was reluctant to let it go. One morning, however, I realized I had to get rid of it, for my reprieve was running out, and if I didn't get rid of it, I was going to get drunk, and I didn't want to get drunk anymore. In my prayer that morning, I asked God to point at me to some way to be free of this resentment. During the day, a friend of mine brought me some magazines to take to a hospital group I was interested in. I looked through them, and a banner across the front of one featured an article by a prominent clergyman in which I caught the words resentment. He said, in effect, if you have a resentment you want to be free of, if you pray for the person or thing you resent, you will be free. If you ask in prayers for everything you want for yourself to be given to them, you will be free. Ask for their health, their prosperity, their happiness, and you will be free. Even when you don't really want it for them, and your prayers are only words, and you don't mean it, go ahead and do it anyway. Do it every day for 2 weeks, and you will find that you have come to mean it and want it for them, and you realize that where there used to be bitterness and resentment and hatred, you will now feel compassionate, understanding, and love.
You know, this thing really does work. If you have a resentment, and you're holding on to that resentment, and you've been using that resentment to justify your failures and your inadequacies, and you've been using that resentment to rationalize the things that you want to do, which you probably know really aren't the things you should do, and you don't want to get rid of that resentment, then for God's sake, don't pray about it. Because if you do, it's going to disappear. I know from past experience. When I filled out my resentment sheet and everything, when I was taking step 4, I had one guy on here that I just absolutely hated him with a purple passion. And I would gladly have killed him if I could have and got by without getting caught and going to the penitentiary. And I know I got rid of most of the resentments whenever I filled the sheet out. As the book says, most of them did appear absolutely double stupid to me. And Joe says we don't want to appear stupid, and I didn't want to, and most of those resentments did disappear, but this one really hung in there. And I never will forget talking about it to my sponsor, and I told him what this thing was doing to me. He said, Charlie, you're going to have to get rid of that resentment. And I said, I don't want to get rid of it. And he said, I didn't ask you if you wanted to get rid of it. He said, I said you have to get rid of it. He said, if you don't, it's going to cause you to drink sooner or later. And I said, well, how in the hell can you get rid of it when you hate him as bad as I hate him? And he said, let me show you how. And he took me to this example in the back of the book, and he said, now read that. And I read it, and he said, do you understand what it said? And I said, yeah, I do. And he said, well, go home and do it. And he said, if you'll go home and do it, I guarantee you'll lose that resentment. And I never shall forget, I went home, and I got down on my knees, which I very seldom did in those days, and I began to pray for this guy. And I said, God, I want you to give that son of a bitch everything he deserves. And that's the only prayer that I could say for that guy that day. But the next day I prayed for him again. And the next day I prayed again, and I don't know when it was, but 3 or 4 or 5 days later I found myself beginning to say, God, let that fellow have in his life what I would like to have in mine. Give to him the peace of mind and serenity and happiness that I seek for myself. And again, I don't know when it happened, but some 3 or 4 or 5 days after that, I woke up one morning and I realized that resentment was gone. And today I meet that guy on the street and we speak to each other and we shake hands and we're good friends again. This thing really does work. You see, my book doesn't leave me hanging out there by myself at all. My book has shown me how to look at resentments. My book has shown me how to analyze resentments. My book has shown me how to see where they come from. My book has told me what they do to me. My book has told me why I must get rid of them, and my book has now told me how to get rid of them. And just think. Now here's a mind that's been running on resentments all of its life, as far back as I can remember. And all of a sudden these resentments are beginning to disappear. And as those things begin to leave my mind, nature will not allow a vacuum anywhere, even in the human personality. And as those things begin to leave my mind, something else has to take their place. And I find that in the first time, instead of having resentments in there, I have a little bit of patience. And I have a little bit of tolerance and a little bit of understanding for my fellow human being. And for the first time in my life, I begin to experience some of those things. You know, if resentments are gone, then God can begin to enter that part of my mind which was always controlled by resentments before, and God can now start to direct that part of my mind. He can't do that as long as those resentments are there. But as they leave, I find that I begin to change in my attitude and outlook upon life toward people, places, and things. Now, it would do me no good, though, to get rid of those resentments if I did not know how to keep them from coming back in the future. Because if I got rid of them all today and didn't know how to handle them in the future, then next week I'd get another one back. And then a day or two later another, and then another, and then another, and all of a sudden my mind would be filled with them again, and God's will would be blocked out again. So my book gives me one final thing to do with resentments, and that's on page 67, middle of the page. It says, referring to our list again, putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done, we resolutely look for our own mistakes. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened? Though a situation had not been entirely our fault, we tried to disregard the other person involved entirely. Where were we to blame? The inventory was ours, not the other man's. When we saw our faults, we listed them, we placed them before us in black and white. We admitted our wrongs honestly and were willing to set these matters straight. Now then, if you would take that fourth column that we asked you to fold under in the beginning. And if we would now use the fourth column, we can complete the final thing it wants us to do in the middle of page 67. We now read the thing from left to right. We read the person's name we're resentful of. We read the cause of the resentment. We read the part of self that was affected. And then we read the nature of our wrong, our fault, our mistake, our defect, our shortcoming, whatever you want to call it. And believe me, we're going to see in a little while where Bill used these words interchangeably, back and forth, round and around. We're going to look to see that the part that we played in this thing. And you know, as I begin to do that, I begin to realize some things that I'd never thought about before. I begin to realize that every resentment that I had, I, in the beginning, had done something to set the ball rolling. That I had made a decision somewhere based on self, which later placed me in a position to be hurt. And I realized that I had rationalized my part away and transferred all the blame to the other person who had retaliated against me. For instance, I hated my wife Barbara. I really did. Now, again, with a purple passion. And I had Barbara's name on here. And the cause of my resentment or anger toward Barbara was, by golly, the last year I drank, she filed for divorce 3 times. She was spending more money on the lawyers than I was spending on booze. And that really, really disturbed me when she did this. I looked to see the part of self was affected, and it was practically everything. My self-esteem, what are other people going to think about me with Barbara suing me for divorce? My personal relationships with her and my children were involved. My material and emotional security was involved. My sex instincts were involved. It was a threat to all 3 basic instincts of life. And I felt justified in having that resentment toward her. But then when I looked in the 4th column, and I began to look at the part I had played, I began to realize that I had made some decisions back there based on self, which placed me in a position to be hurt. I got to going out and running around and doing some things I shouldn't be doing. And as a result of me doing the things that I shouldn't be doing, I got caught at it. And when I got caught at it, she filed for divorce. Based on my own selfishness, I put myself in that position. Based on my own dishonesty, I put myself in that position. Based on my own inconsideration of my wife and my children, if I had considered what they needed and wanted, I wouldn't have been out there doing those things in the first place. And I began to realize that I put me there. And then Barbara had retaliated against me, and then I had transferred all blame to her, rationalized away the part that I had played. Oh, this man I hated so bad that I could have killed him. When I looked that thing over, I was absolutely amazed. His name was Jim. And the cause of my resentment toward him was that he and I had gone into business together, and it was a pretty successful business. And one day Jim just up and absconded with the funds and left the country. And my God, I hated him with a purple passion for that. Now, the parts of self that were affected with self-esteem, what do people think about me? The parts of self that would be affected with certainly the material and the emotional security. And I really hated this guy. But when I looked to see the part that I had played in it, I suddenly realized that I made a decision based on self which placed me in a position to be hurt by him. He didn't come to me to be a partner. I went to him to be a partner. And the only reason I went to him to be a partner is because he had something I needed. First thing he had some money. And the second thing he knew more about this thing than I did, and I needed his knowledge, and I talked him into being my partner based on my own selfishness and my own inconsideration of other human beings. I wasn't concerned about him at all. I didn't give a damn whether he made a nickel or not. I was interested in me. And I put myself in that position to be hurt. And you know, as I looked at those resentments, I found that 95% of them all were from the same thing. Nearly every one was something or somebody that I had done something to. And then they in turn had retaliated against me and created pain and suffering for me. And then I had transferred all blame to them through my resentment and absolutely excused myself. I was just as pure as the driven snow. And I didn't realize what I had been doing until I looked at this thing. You know, the resentment is the wrong. But what is the nature of the wrong? And I go to the dictionary and I look up the word nature, and it says the inherent characteristic of something. I always thought nature dealt with the birds and the bees only. But it says it's the inherent characteristic of something. What is the inherent characteristic of this resentment? What is the core of this resentment? What's within me that caused the resentment in the first place? And I realize that I've got certain defects in my personality. And those defects happen to be this selfishness, this dishonesty, this self-seeking, frightened, inconsiderate human being. That's what self had made me into. And I realized that those are the things that kept putting me in those positions to be hurt. And those are the things which ultimately created my resentment toward people. And if I wanted to keep resentments from coming back in the future, I was going to have to do something about those parts of my personality. And if I can get rid of selfishness, if I can get rid of dishonesty, if I can get rid of being frightened, if I can get rid of inconsideration for other people, then I won't be making decisions based on self. And I won't be putting me in positions to be hurt. And in the future, maybe I'll be able to live without resentments. For the first time in my life, I can see what these things are really, really doing to me. And I was absolutely amazed when I looked at them. Now I understand why I have to get rid of resentments. And I understand now why I have to get rid of these parts of my personality in order to keep them from coming back in the future, if I want any chance of peace of mind, happiness, and serenity. Without those things, I'll always go back to drinking, Joe.
Okay, as we analyze these things and fill out this last list, which is really the fourth column, is really the information we want to gather. You know, we went through these other three columns, and we really want to see the fourth column, the exact nature of our wrongs. These are the things, and we want to see the character defects and the shortcomings. These are the things that we're going to talk about in the rest of the program. And I was like Charlie, you know, I had a deep resentment against my mother-in-law. They're supposed to be legal to have those, you know. It's kind of a joke, but I really hated this woman. And it was a bitter hate, you know, and it could just come to my mind and just tear me all apart. And for many years I carried it. And I realized, you know, when I listed this thing and analyzed it, you know, I usually had a name. That was simple. And what she did, she interfered with my marriage. And then when I looked which part of self was involved, every one. It affected my self-esteem, it affected my material security, it affected my companionship, it affected my emotional security, it affected my sex life. Every area of self was affected. And then I was able to look, well, what role did I play in it? You know, it was the same, every one of them, selfishness, dishonesty, self-seeking, the things I had done, you know, and to her, to my daughter, and to her daughter, and to my family. This woman just retaliated like any other mother should do. You know. And then I blamed her for what she did, and I set the ball rolling. But once we can analyze those things and inventory them, and then he says we should have made out our list for step 8 when we took step 4. Once I list and analyze this woman that I resented, I didn't resent her anymore. She went on the list. She was a person that I need to make amends to. She went on the list for step 8. You know, once I analyzed this thing, I realized I didn't hate her anymore. I owed her an amends because I set the ball rolling.
Nearly every name on that resentment list, we realize that those are the people we've hurt.
Yeah.
So we are building the list of the people we've harmed. Now, not always, but in most cases, when I really analyzed the resentment, I realized that I had done something to those people. They had retaliated back, and then I had hated them for doing it. And I realized, hell, I've harmed those people. So I'm making the list for step 8 and what I'm going to use in step 9 as I do this sheet also. Also, step 5 says we admitted to God, to ourselves, and another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. The wrong is the resentment, and the exact nature of it is the part of thy personality that causes it in the first place, the defects of character. And Bill only talks about these 4 in the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. That's the only ones we discussed there. And I realize now I've got the information on this sheet that I'm going to take to the other human being when I do step 5. I realize also in the 4th column I've got the defects of character that I'm going to become willing to get rid of in 6, and I've got those things I'm going to ask God to take away in 7. The inventory done as the big book says to do it on this sheet lays the groundwork for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And it gives me all the information I'm going to need as far as these resentments are concerned throughout step 9 its entirety. And when we finally realize this, we looked at this thing for 12 years before we finally found the instructions on how to take it. And we finally once realized the simplicity of this thing, and what it does, it just literally blew our mind. I think the reason we've had so much trouble with step 4 is we complicated people have been looking for something extremely hard to do. And this inventory done as the big book says to do it is a very simple thing, and it's so simple we never could see it before. Today I realize that Bill, when he wrote this for very, very sick people. Those people were sick people. And if it had been very complicated, they never would have been able to understand it. And I think today, if it's too complicated, we can't understand it, but if it's too simple, we overlook it. If you've never tried this on resentments, and you don't want to get rid of a resentment, don't try it. This thing really works now. It clears that part of our mind and keeps resentments away from us in the future. Now that I've learned how to do this, every time I feel a resentment, I can stop. And I can run that sucker through this process of analyzing it, and I can get rid of it just like that. I don't have to have resentments anymore if I don't want to have them. But with that comes an awesome responsibility, and the responsibility that comes with it is this: I can no longer justify a resentment. I can no longer blame you for the way I feel. Now, I could before because I didn't know what to do about it, but today I know how to handle it, take care of it, and get rid of it. And if I've got it today, then it's because I have chosen to have it today. I tell you, that's tough when you go to taking responsibility for your own feelings and your own behavior, and you quit blaming people for it. But it is sure nice to be free of resentments. That part of my mind has some peace of mind, some serenity, and some happiness, and it never had that before step 4. So we have looked at, worked at, got rid of, and saw how to keep from coming back in the future the first common manifestation of self, which is resentments. Joe?
Okay, now we're going to go into the second area of manifestation of self. Notice the word fear, which is bracketed along with difficulties with Mr. Brown, Mrs. Jones' employer, my wife. This short word somehow touches almost every aspect of our life. It was an evil and cordon thread. The fabric of our existence was shot through with it. And this is true, and there's a second manifestation. If you show us a selfish, self-centered person, he's always full of fear. You know, some part of self is threatened. Again, we can go back to the step 3 when we studied the things that made up self. If you threaten my companionship, my self-esteem, if you threaten one of those things, if you threaten my security, if you threaten my sex life, I have fear. So our lives are shut. A self-centered person is full of fear. He don't know what's going to happen, but he knows it's going to happen. And fear is a part of every human life. We couldn't live one day without fear. We call it caution, and we couldn't go across the street without it. We all need it. It's a negative indicator that tells us to do something. And there's one thing about it, you know, if we go overworking it, it's telling us to do something when there ain't nothing to do. I tell people it's sort of like a negative indicator on our cars. We got to have negative indicators on our cars. They indicate certain actions to take when something goes wrong to protect the car, and that's what fear is. We have natural fear to tell us what to do to protect our lives, but we overuse it. We selfish, self-centered individuals. An alcoholic is just like a man driving down the road. You know, we got these red lights on our dashboard to tell us when the car gets hot, so we put some water in to save the engine. And we need that. We really need that for the protection of the car. But we alcoholics, we drive down the road looking at the red lights. We don't look out the windshield. We're just staring at the red lights, and we run into a telephone pole waiting for that light to come on. Well, that light has to be there, but you ain't supposed to stare at it, you know. So the overuse of this thing. We're trying to get this, we're going to list it. We're living in this head, and we don't know the truth. And we're trying to list these things and analyze them. Willie said we're going to talk to someone else about them. We're going to get down to the real true, the ones that are really true issues that we can live by, and the ones, the others we're going to get rid of.
You know, fear is just like a resentment. Fear effectively blocks us off from God's will. A mind that is filled with fear is constantly making decisions based upon fear and constantly taking actions based upon fear. And usually when we take those things based upon fear only, normally it's the wrong action to take. And we usually end up again hurting people because of the fact that we have overreacted to a fear situation. And my book says that fear sets in motion trains of circumstances that literally destroy us in the future. And it said fear ought to be classified with stealing. It seems to cause more trouble. And on page 68 it tells us exactly what to do with fear. It says, we reviewed our fears thoroughly. We put them on paper, even though we had no resentment in connection with them. So column 1, we list our fears, whatever they might be. Fear of people, fear of places, fear of institutions, fear of whatever it might be. And it's amazing how many fears that we actually have. Now, we men like to say, well, I don't have any fears. After all, I'm tough. You know, we like to put out that macho image. But we're not talking about physical fears. We're talking about these emotional fears and thoughts that we have in our head. And all of us are filled with them. You know, my golly, I was afraid of Barbara, my wife. I had fears connected with my children. What's going to happen to my children? I had fears connected with my daughter because she's exactly like I am, and I know she's got a hell of a life coming on here before long. You know, I had fears connected with the police department. Always been afraid of them. I guess I'm always going to be. I had fears connected with the federal government. I had fears connected with the Internal Revenue Service. I had all kinds of fears, and I didn't realize how many fears I had until I listed them on a piece of paper. Just like resentment. You can only see one fear at a time in your head. But when we once list them on a piece of paper, we can see how many we got and what we're afraid of. And for the first time, I begin to realize how fear dominated my life just as much resentments ever did. Then in column 2, I put down, why do I have that fear? In other words, why I'm afraid of this thing, whatever it might be. And an example of this is, the reason I'm afraid of Barbara is because if she ever does really find out what I was doing, chances are there'll be a 4th divorce in our family also. You know, I had fears connected with the Internal Revenue Service. Why did I have them? Because, by God, I cheated on my income tax. And I'm scared to death they're going to catch me at it. And I find that nearly every fear that I had, usually it was based on something that I myself had set that ball rolling again. Usually it was because of something that I had created in the first place. And you know, I begin to notice that many of the names on my fears list were the same as those on my resentment list. You know, a lot of those people I resented really hadn't caught me yet. And I had fears connected with what are they going to do when they do catch me. And I begin to notice the same fears appearing on both sheets. The same names appearing on both sheets. Some fears, maybe I don't know why I had them. You know, this is not going to be an attempt to psychoanalyze ourselves. Some of us might be afraid of the dark. Well, I'm not going to try to figure out that's because Mother didn't change my diapers right when I was 3 years old. I don't know why I'm afraid of the dark. I'm just afraid of the dark. And I'll put it down there. I don't know why. I'm just afraid of the dark. Then I look at the third column and I see which part of self is affected. Which part of self caused the fear? And I find that every fear I have is because of some threat to or some perceived threat to one of my basic instincts of life. Anything that's a threat to my place in society creates fear. Anything that's a threat to my security instinct creates fear. Anything that's a threat to my sex life creates fear. Anything that's a threat to my ambitions in those areas creates fear. Then finally I read it all the way across. I read what I'm afraid of. Why do I have the fear? Which part of self caused it? And then I look at the exact nature of that fear. And I find the same identical character defects. If I was not such a selfish person, I would not be putting myself in positions where I have to experience fear. If I was not such a dishonest person, I wouldn't have stolen from the Internal Revenue Service to start with. If I wasn't such a frightened individual, I wouldn't be doing things because I'm afraid I'm not going to get to do them in the future and I better get them all done today while I can. If I wasn't such an inconsiderate human being, I wouldn't be doing things that hurt other people. I would be considering what they need. And if I didn't hurt them, then I don't have to fear what they're going to do when they find out. And I find that the same basic personality defects, character defects, shortcomings, faults, mistakes, whatever you want to call them, are at the root of the fears as I have at the root of the resentments. I see for the first time in my life what I need to change within me if I want to get rid of fear in the future. And if I don't get rid of those things, then I'll constantly be experiencing fear for the rest of my life. Now my book shows me how to look at fears, how to analyze fears, to see what part I play in the fears, and then my book tells me how to get rid of those fears. Joe?
So perhaps there's a better way, we think so. But we're now on a different basis. The basis of trust and relying upon God. We trust the infinite God rather than our finite selves. We are in the world to play the role He assigns. Just to the extent we do as we think He would have us, and humbly rely on Him, does He enable us to match calamity with serenity. Now, we never apologize for depending upon our Creator. We can laugh at those who think spirituality a way of weakness. Paradoxically, it's a way of strength. The verdict of these ages is that faith means courage. All men of faith have courage. They trust their God and never apologize for God. Instead, they let Him demonstrate through us what He can do. And we have another prayer. The second prayer in step 4, we have one for resentment. Now we have one for fear. We asked Him to remove our fear and to direct our attention to what He have us be. At once we commence to outgrow fear. And we analyze these fears out, just like we did our resentments. We look at them and we see the real truth of them, and most of them will go away. And the ones that stay and we can't get rid of, we pray about, and they will be removed. You know, fear is a part of our every life, and as we said, you know, we have certain healthy fears, and sometimes we can't discern which is which. You know, we can't discern whether this is a real fear or an abnormal fear. I had a guy come to me and talking about this one day, and he was real concerned. And he said, "Well, I got a problem." And you know, we alcoholics, we all got big problems. And he told me he had a fear of heights. I told him, "Don't worry about that one." because he didn't have no damn wings. He's supposed to be afraid, you know. We're supposed to be afraid of heights because we ain't got wings. So don't worry about that one. But we can't tell which is which. We're in this life, and we don't know really, as Willie said tonight, we don't really know the truth. We only can operate on what we believe is the truth. We just interpret the truth. And we don't know it. This is why, one way, we got to analyze. In the fourth step, we never have done this before. When we get in the fifth step, as Willie was saying, we got to seek this through somebody else. Because, it's not nothing that we can do within ourselves. If we do it, we're going to be traveling off misinformation.
I think we need to realize, too, that we're probably not going to get rid of all fears. And probably we're not going to get rid of all resentments. Because if we did, we would then become perfect human beings. And I don't think God's going to let us get that good, because we'd be just like Him. Resentments and fears do serve useful purposes in society. A good example of a useful resentment is if I'm living in my neighborhood, and I've been there for years, and the old neighborhood's getting run down, paint's peeling off all the houses, fences falling down, grass growing in the yards too high, too deep, and I'm sitting on my front porch, and I have accepted that as a part of our condition. And I sit on my front porch, and I rock, and I rock, and I rock, and I'm just as happy as I can be. Now, somebody moves in across the street. They buy that house and move in over there. And they go down to the department store, and they buy about 10 gallons of paint. And they come home, and they scrape that house, and they start painting that house. And immediately I resent them for that. I say, who in the hell they think they are? Moving into our neighborhood and screwing the damn thing up like that. And he paints, and I rock, and I resent, and I get madder and madder and madder. Now, if the resentment is to be used correctly, the resentment would cause me to do something that is a positive thing. It would cause me to get out of my rocking chair, go to the store and buy 10 gallons of paint and paint my own house. And then when I painted my house, it would cause maybe the next person to paint their house, and then God, through resentments, after a while, would have the whole neighborhood cleaned up. And a resentment can be used right. But we alcoholics don't use them right. Him sitting over there, him over there painting that house, and me sitting on my front porch rocking, and the more he paints, and the madder I get, and after a while, about midnight, 4 or 5 days later, I'll go over and burn his damn house down. That's what resentments do to us. Resentments cause us to do things that we normally would not do. And then that hurts people, and they retaliate against us. But we are the ones that set the ball rolling. Fears do identically the same thing. Without fear, you can't cross the street without getting run over. Without fear, God, I'd hate to see this room without fear tonight. If there wasn't some fear in this room tonight, if we wasn't a little bit afraid of what we think of each other, and we all told the damn truth about what we think about each other, there'd be hell to pay in here tonight. Fear serves a useful purpose. And we're not going to get rid of all of them, because if we did, that means we would not have any self-will, and God's not going to let that happen. But what we can do is get them down to the level that God intended for them to be. And then we can live with these things with peace of mind and happiness and serenity rather than through resentment and fear. And just think now, if these fears begin to disappear out of my mind, resentments are already gone. And if fears begin to disappear, and my mind becomes more and more and more free of those fears, then once again something has to replace fear. And about the only thing that can replace that fear is a little bit of courage. A little bit of faith in this God as I'm trying to understand it. And now that the fears are gone, then there's another area of my mind that God can enter and begin to direct my thinking. He already can do it in the area of resentments because they're gone, and now He can do it in the area of the fears themselves as they begin to disappear. And I find myself with a little more peace of mind, a little more serenity, and a little more happiness. This is a positive step. There's nothing negative about step 4 at all. This is a positive step. This removes these things and begins to give us peace of mind right in the middle of it. Now there's one other area that we need to look at as far as the third common manifestation of self. And it seems as though that through and because of the sexual instinct, we probably hurt more people easier, faster in that way than in any other. And my book is going to suggest to me that I take a look at my sex life in the past to see what it has created, the harms it has created, and to see where it's created pain and suffering for me. And also to see if there might not be a better way to shape a sex life in the future so I don't get into so much trouble with it as the days and the years go by. Now, you know, sex for we human beings is a little different than it is for the rest of the animals in the world. You know, for most of the animals in the world, even though they have a sexual instinct and a sex drive, it normally only takes place in them at a certain preordained time of the year. And that will differ with different animals, whatever their race might be. And when God is ready for them to reproduce, then He creates some physical changes in the female. The male senses the physical change, and then the male undergoes his physical change, and then the two join together, and it's kind of like bang, bang, thank you, ma'am. And as soon as he gets through with it, then he's off and running. Now, they didn't think about doing it before, and they didn't think about it while they were doing it, and they don't think about it after they're through with it. And they don't have the right to choose when they're going to have sex and who they're going to have it with and where they're going to have it. That is all determined by God because they are God-directed. But God gave us human beings self-will. And He gave us the ability to think and reason and make decisions. And when He did that, He gave us the ability to decide where we're going to have sex, and when we're going to have sex, and who we're going to have it with, and what position it's going to be in, and how many times we're going to have it, and etc. And I think there is the breeder of the problems of the human race, based upon the fact that we can think about it. You know, we think about it beforehand, we think about it while we're doing it, we think about it after we're doing it, and it creates all kinds of problems for the human race. And we're not going to deal so much with physical sex. The book deals with emotional sex, how we think about sex. You know, at the bottom of page 68 it said, now about sex. And any of us needed an overhauling there. Now, you older fellas, don't get your hopes up. This don't deal with physical sex. This is emotional sex only. But above all, we tried to be sensible on this question. It's so easy to get way off the track. Here we find human opinions running to extremes, absurd extremes perhaps. One set of voices cried that sex is a lust of our lower nature, a base necessity of procreation. And we do have that set of voices. We've heard them all of our life. They're the ones that say sex is dirty, sex should not be enjoyed, sex is only to be used to reproduce the human race, that if you enjoy it, it's sinful, and you're only supposed to do it at one time, in one place, with one person, in one position, and anything else is wrong. And we've heard those voices all of our life. Then we have the voices who cry for sex and more sex, who bewail the institution of marriage, who think that most of the troubles of the race are traceable to sex causes. They think we do not have enough of it, or that it isn't the right kind. They see its significance everywhere. And we do have that school of voices today. You know, those are the ones that say you ought to be able to do sex anywhere you want to, anytime you want to, with anybody you want to, in any position you want to, as many times as you want to, and you ought to be able to enjoy it every time you do it. And I think today they might call that the sexual revolution. And I really don't have anything wrong with that, except it happened about 20 years too late for me to take advantage of it. One school would allow man no flavor for his fare, and the other would have us all on a straight pepper diet. I just love the way Bill Wilson writes. He's a dinger, isn't he? He said, we want to stay out of this controversy. We do not want to be the arbiter of anyone's sex conduct. We all have sex problems. We'd hardly be human if we didn't. What can we do about them? And I read that with great relief. What that tells me is the book is not going to condemn me for what I've been in the past, nor is the book going to try to tell me what I have to do in the future. It says we're going to stay out of this controversy. We don't want to be the arbiter of anyone's sex conduct. Now, what the book does suggest that I do is this. It says we reviewed our own conduct over the years past. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, or inconsiderate? Whom had we hurt? Did we unjustifiably arouse jealousy, suspicion, or bitterness? Where were we at fault? What should we have done instead? We got this all down on paper and looked at it. So we have a third sheet that we use for the inventory, and we treat it exactly as we do resentments and fears. We list them, we analyze them, we see what causes them, and we try to see what to do about it in the future. So let's look at your third sheet, a review of our sex conduct.
Okay, as we see the instructions right in this paragraph, we reviewed our sex conduct of the past years. We see the character defects where we've been selfish, dishonest, inconsiderate. The same character defects that we saw in the resentments, the same identical character defects. Put down whom did we hurt in the first column. What did we do in the second column? Which part of self was threatened? And then we put down which character defect was involved. I think the sex, as we say, this review will give us a different picture of our sex conduct. You know, we all have a lot of guilt, a lot of shame about these things. But once we get them down and we list and analyze them, we can get a little truer picture and maybe relieve us. This is what's so positive about the inventory. You know, it would appear as we put down who we hurt in the first column, what we did. But when we come to the third column, which part of self caused that problem? You know, it would appear that obviously, just off the top of your head, we'd always thought it was a sex that caused this. Maybe this was a part of self that should have caused the sex conduct, but we find out once we list and analyze these things, we'll find that this is not true in most cases. We're going to find out that most of our sex conduct problems with other people were caused by more or less our social instinct, our security instinct, not our sex instinct.
Once in a great while, as I looked and analyzed my sex conduct of the past, once in a great while I would see where I had done something considered to be wrong sexually based upon the sex instinct. You know, purely for the physical release and the emotional gratification that comes from sex, doing it by the sex instinct itself. But I found in the majority of the cases where I had done the wrong things in the past, it wasn't based on the sex instinct. It was based on the social instinct or the security instinct. And I found that very early on as a young fellow growing up. The more members of the opposite sex you can attract to yourself, the greater man you can be. You know, we can use sex to build our ego. Now, I don't know what you girls call it, but we boys call that John Wayneism. And we found the more members of the opposite sex could be attracted to us, the more of them we can have relations with, then the greater we can feel about ourselves, and we build our own ego using sex to do that. We find that sometimes we use sex not for the sex instinct, but just because we're lonely. And sometimes all we want is recognition from another human being. Maybe we're just lonely and we're afraid and we desperately want somebody to recognize us, and maybe we give sex to them to buy back some form of security from them, emotional security. Or sometimes we use sex to buy material security. Sometimes we find ourselves in sexual situations we really don't care to be in, but we find that if we're not in it and don't do what they want us to do, if we're overly dependent upon them materially, that if we don't do what they want, they may cut that off. And we use sex to buy material security. You know, sometimes we use sex to force our will on another human being. Sometimes they're not doing what we want them to do. And we say, well, we'll just give them that silent treatment Willie talked about, and we'll cut them off at the pass, and we won't let them have none until they do what we want them to do. Now, we boys aren't too good at that. We only last 3 or 4 days. But I'll guarantee you girls have perfected that to a science. You know exactly how to do that. Sometimes we use sex to get even with people. Sometimes we're in a relationship with another human being and they go out and do things that they shouldn't do, and that hurts us and that infuriates us, and we say, by God, we'll show them. And then we'll go out and we'll do the same identical thing to show them and to get even with them. And the fallacy in that is after we've done it, we can't even tell them we did it. We didn't get even with anybody at all, but we use sex for that purpose. And what the book is suggesting is that I look at my sexual conduct of the past and see perhaps where I have misused it. Use it for things other than what God intended for it to be. And I find that every time I've misused it, that's created pain and suffering for another human being. And then that human being in turn has retaliated against me, and that creates pain and suffering for me. We're not talking about morality. We're not talking about right and wrong. We're talking about hurting other people. And if we continue to hurt other people and they retaliate against us, then that in turn creates problems for us. And we're not going to be able to stay sober unless we have peace of mind and serenity and happiness. Also, we have a conscience. We have a soul. We all know when we do something wrong. And when we hurt one that we love dearly, then we get to feel the guilt and the remorse and the fears associated with that. And there's no way we can have peace of mind. If I continue to conduct myself in the future as I have in the past, I cut myself off from peace of mind and happiness, period. Maybe it feels good while I'm doing it, but am I willing to pay the price for what it's going to cost me in the future? It's not a question of morality at all. It's a question of whether can I still do these things and stay sober. And I find that for me, I can't do that. We hurt a lot of people sexually. I most certainly hurt my wife by going out and committing adultery. I most certainly hurt my children because when Barbara sued me for divorce, it created problems for my kids within my own home. I most certainly perhaps hurt the other sexual partner in that relationship. And maybe I hurt that person's spouse and that person's children also. Maybe some of us didn't do anything wrong sexually, physically, but almost every one of us has created some jealousy, suspicion, bitterness in the minds of other human beings, and we do it a lot of times on purpose. A lot of times we do those things on purpose. And my book says I ought to look at this and see who I've harmed and see what caused me to do it and see if it's really sex that's doing it or is it one of the other basic instincts. And to my amazement, I found out that sex really doesn't have a hell of a lot to do with it. And that did two things for me immediately. The first thing it did is it got rid of some of the guilt. When I realized I wasn't doing sex that way because of the sex instinct, that I was doing it to build my own ego, then I realized that I'm a sick human being and I've been using sex for the wrong purposes, not because I'm bad, but because I'm sick. And some of the guilt began to disappear immediately. And also when I realized that I used sex to build my own ego, not with the sex instinct, but because of the own building of the ego, suddenly I found myself not wanting to do it quite as bad as I did before. I thought I'd always been oversexed, and that's why I went out and did those things. But hell, I'm not oversexed. I'm just like any other human being. I used that stuff to make me feel better, to build my ego, and when I found out that's why I'm doing it, then I began to lose interest in doing it quite as much as I did before. I hope I never do lose complete interest in it. And then I looked again in the fourth column. What's the exact nature of the wrong, the fault, the mistake, the defect, the shortcoming? And I find those same basic character defects. Selfishness, dishonesty, self-seeking and frightened, and inconsideration. I wouldn't have been doing those things to hurt Barbara and my kids if I hadn't have been so selfish. I wouldn't have been doing those things if I'd been considering what's it going to do to the other partner in that arrangement and her family. I wouldn't have been doing those things if I hadn't been so frightened. I'm such a fearful person, I needed that to build my ego. As I get older, I begin to think, my golly, the day comes when I'll never be able to do it again, and I better get all I can while I'm at it. That's nothing in the world but fear. It causes me to go out and do those things. And I begin to change my attitude towards sex completely through the use of this inventory sheet. I never realized I hurt that many people. I never realized that the things I did created that much trouble for people. I never realized that's why they keep raising hell with me. I never realized that sex came from the other basic instincts of life as much or more than it did from the sexual instinct. I never realized what sex was doing to me until I got it on paper and looked at it. The same as resentment, the same as fears, and the same as harms I've done to other people. Now my book shows me not only how to look at these things, but it gives me some ideas of what I should do in the future to prevent these troubles from occurring as I go through life. Joe?
In this way, we try to shape a sane, sound idea of our future sex life. We subject each relationship to this test. Was it selfish or not?
Each relationship to this test. Was it selfish or not?
Then we have prayer.
The book doesn't care if you want to do sex hanging upside down by your toenails from a tree limb. That's fine with the book. But if you're forcing another human being to have sex with you hanging upside down from a tree limb by their toenails when they don't want to, then that's probably for selfish reasons. And we may harm other people in doing these kinds of things. So the book don't care. But it says you ought to look at each one of them. Was it selfish or was it not? If it's selfish, chances are it may hurt another human being. And if so, sooner or later we pay the price for that. In retaliation, guilt, remorse, and fear.
We ask God to mold our ideas and help us live up to them. And then we see this is the next prayer is in sex. And we're going to have some other prayers in this particular. It's one of our strongest instincts. And that are God-given and therefore need to be used lightly, selfish, or despised or low. Whatever our ideas turn out to be, we must be willing to grow toward it. And we must be willing to grow toward that goal. We must be willing to make amends where we have done harm, provided we do not bring about still more harm in doing so. Now, we put these people as obviously these harms is a part of the list for step 8 too. But still, he's talking about step 9. He's setting us up here. We can't make amends if they're going to harm other people. He's talking about, but we have a step to deal with that when we get to it. But we want to put them on the list. In other words, we treat sex as if any other problem, and it's very hard for we humans to do. In meditation, we ask God what we should do in each specific matter. We see another prayer. The right answer will come if we want it. God alone can judge our sex situation. God alone. Counsel with other persons is desirable. We let God be the final judge. We realize that some people are fanatical about sex and others are loose. We avoid hysteria, thinking our advice. And Willie was talking about that night. We don't know who we're talking to about this. Which side of? We might be talking to one from the sexual revolution and one from the conservatives. And I'm sure we alcoholics, you know how we are. We are cunning and baffling and powerful. An alcoholic can go around in AA and he can find somebody. He can talk to 100 people. He'll find somebody that agrees with him. If he hunts long enough, you're going to find somebody to agree with what you want to do.
You still ought to have a problem in this sexual thing, and I'd ask somebody in AA what I would do about it. And if they didn't tell me what I wanted to hear, then I went to somebody else. And then somebody else, and after a while I found somebody that would agree with me. And the book says God alone can judge our sex situation. I could throw a sexual problem out in this room tonight and we'd get 100 different answers before the night was over. And really I find that I know what to do anyhow. Deep down in every man, woman, child is the fundamental idea of God. We already know what we ought to be doing, what we shouldn't be doing. I've always had a voice that told me that. It always said, Charlie, you ought to be doing this. And I'd say, yeah, but it's so much fun. And I'd go right ahead and do it. But I always knew. I didn't have to read any more books to find out how to live. I knew how to live. I think that's that knowledge that's innate within each one of us from the moment of birth. I think that is what the book refers to as this God as we understand Him that dwells within all human beings.
Okay, suppose we fall short of the chosen idea and stumble. We set our goals. Does this mean we're going to get drunk? Some people tell us so, but this is only half true. It depends on our motives. If we are sorry for what we have done and have the honest desire to let God take us to better things, we will be forgiven and have learned our lesson. But if we are not sorry and our conduct continues to harm others, we'll cut short to drink. We're not theorizing. These are facts of our experience. And I think that that is one rule. If we're ever in doubt of anything that we're about to do, we don't know if it's right or wrong for us. But it's something that we're going to do in our lives. If it's going to harm other people, then it's wrong for us. To sum up about sex, we earnestly pray, and again we have another prayer 3 times. We pray for the right idea, for guidance in these questionable situations, and for sanity and for strength to do the right thing. If sex is very troublesome, we throw ourselves harder into helping others. And this is a real too in this particular issue. And it'll work on any other problem that we have. We throw ourselves harder into helping others. We think of their needs and work for them. This takes us out of ourselves and it quiets us and peerless urge when the yell would mean heartache. There's one thing that's automatic for us as alcoholics. If we involve ourselves in helping another alcoholic, this takes us out of self, period. It takes us out of self, whichever problem we're in, whether it's a companionship, or self-esteem, or whichever problem self is. While we're in another alcoholic's life, we're out of our life, and God can come into our life and can quiet this perilous urge or any other resentment or any other problem we might have. Now he sums up this inventory process. If we have been through our personal inventory, we have written down a lot. We got all 3 of these sheets out. We have listed and analyzed our resentments. And he doesn't say it, but actually, maybe he was brief, but we have listed and analyzed our fears. We have listed and analyzed our sex conduct of the past. We have begun to comprehend their futility and their fatality. We have commenced to see their terrible destruction. We have begun to learn tolerance, patience, and goodwill toward all men, even our enemies, for we look on them as sick people. And then, we said we were going to have a personality change as a result of these steps. And we can already see the personality change coming by after step 4. We have listed people we have hurt by our conduct and are willing to straighten out the past if we can. We have made that list with step 8 and 9. And then we look at these sheets, we see we got really the end of step 4. In the first 2 columns, we got really the resentments, the fears, and the sex thing, and what they did. And then really the center of the 3rd column is the part of self is involved. We talked about that in step 3. And over in the 4th column, we got the information for steps 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So we have done the inventory this way. We have all that information laid out, and we can look at all of it. It gives us a true picture of our stock in trade. We can really see the total business we're running. For the first time as human beings, we can look at our business, and we can see the unsaleable items that we got on our shelf. In this book, we read again and again that faith is for us we cannot do for ourselves. We hope you are convinced now that God can remove whatever self-will has blocked you off from Him. If you have made a decision, this is step 3, and an inventory of your grosser handicaps, step 4, you have made a good beginning. That being so, you have swallowed and digested some big chunks of truth about yourself.
You'll notice this talks about the grosser handicaps. It recognizes, well, we'll get this thing perfect. It would be impossible to do step 4 perfect. But that's okay. We got other steps on down the line which helps us continue to get rid of character defects more and more as we go through life. Here we've looked at the things which are the gross manifestations of self, the things that really block us off from God's will, and the things that need to be removed from our mind in order for God to direct our thinking. And I'm amazed how the same names kept appearing on all 3 sheets. Resentful at Barbara, afraid of Barbara, and harmed Barbara by my sexual conduct in the past. And on all 3 sheets, I'm amazed that I'm making a list of people I've harmed as I go through these 3 sheets. Now, one other thing I think we need to look at in this area, and I wonder how many of you all have recognized that almost all the information about sex on the big book, or in the big book, is to be found on page 69. I don't know that it has any meaning, but that's where almost all of it is on page 69. Don't tell me Bill Wilson didn't have a sense of humor. Piggy, we're through for the night. Again, we hope you all have enjoyed it, and we'll see you tomorrow. You're a great bunch of people. We really love you.